It was a bitter winter evening when Officer Daniel Morris received a call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The anonymous voice on the other end was shaky, almost afraid to speak, claiming that something terrible was happening inside an old, sagging house at the end of Hawthorne Lane. The caller mentioned strange noises, muffled cries, metal scraping, coming from the basement every night. Daniel and his partner, Officer Grace Holloway, knew the address well. The neighbors had complained before, but nothing had ever been proven. Tonight, though, the tone in that caller's voice told Daniel that this was different. As they approached the property, the house stood in eerie silence, its peeling paint and cracked windows like scars on its history. The front yard was littered with broken toys, but they were sun-bleached and half-buried in frost, as if no child had touched them for years. Grace knocked on the door, calling out for the homeowner. No answer. They tried again. Still nothing. Then, faintly, Daniel thought he heard it. Soft, desperate whimper, somewhere deep beneath their feet. Grace looked at him wide-eyed. Basement, she mouthed. They moved around the side of the house, finding a narrow storm door half covered in snow. The lock was rusty, but it gave way under Daniel's boot with a sickening snap. A wave of damp, musty air rushed out, carrying the smell of mildew, dust, and something else, something metallic. They switched on their flashlights, the beams slicing through the darkness as they descended the creaking wooden steps. At first, all they saw were piles of old furniture, stacks of boxes, and cobwebs clinging to every corner. Then Grace's light stopped on a shape in the far left corner, half hidden in the shadows. It was small, human. The figure flinched as the light hit him, curling into himself like a frightened animal. "Hey, it's okay," Daniel said softly, moving closer. That's when he saw it. The heavy chain bolted to the wall, locked around the boy's ankle. The child couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. His hair was matted and unkempt, his clothes torn and filthy. His skin was so pale it almost seemed translucent, and his wide blue eyes glistened with fear. "What's your name?" Grace asked gently, crouching down. The boy's lips trembled. "Don't tell her. I spoke to you," he whispered, voice cracking. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Who's her?" But before the boy could answer, there was a sudden sound from upstairs, the unmistakable creak of floorboards under someone's weight. A shadow shifted across the dim light filtering from a small basement window. Footsteps started descending the stairs. Grace and Daniel instinctively stepped in front of the boy, their hands near their weapons. A woman emerged from the gloom, tall, gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too calm for the scene in front of her. She looked at the officers without surprise, as though she'd been expecting them. "I'm his mother," she said flatly, her voice devoid of warmth. "He's special. You wouldn't understand. The chains are for his own safety." Daniel's heart pounded. He'd heard plenty of strange justifications in his career, but nothing like this. He exchanged a glance with Grace. There was something deeply wrong here. The woman's gaze flickered to the boy, and he immediately shrank back, hiding behind Daniel's leg. "You can't take him," she said suddenly, her voice rising. "You have no idea what he's capable of." Grace stepped forward. "Ma'am, you need to explain this now." The woman didn't answer, her eyes darting between them like a trapped animal. For a moment, the basement was silent except for the faint sound of the boy's breathing and the ticking of a leaky pipe. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, came a strange noise, a faint thump, followed by what sounded like a door creaking open. Daniel's gut told him they weren't alone in the house. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, every instinct screaming that something about this night was about to get much worse. The boy's eyes met his, silently begging for help. And in that moment, Daniel knew, whatever was going on here, the truth was darker than they could have imagined. But what he didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning, and what they would uncover next would shake their beliefs about fear, family, and evil itself. If you want to know the terrifying secret this mother was hiding, and why this boy had never seen the outside world, make sure you subscribe, because you won't want to miss what comes next. Daniel's pulse quickened as the chilling stillness of the basement wrapped around him like a heavy, damp blanket, every breath tasting faintly of rust and mold. The boy's frightened gaze clung to him, as if unsure whether Daniel was a savior or just another shadow in his nightmare. "It's okay," Daniel murmured, though his own voice felt too loud for this suffocating space. "You're safe now." Safe! He wasn't even sure if the word belonged here yet. The chain rattled faintly when the boy shifted, the sound slicing through the silence and making Daniel's stomach twist. Somewhere above them, Margaret's voice floated down the stairs, calm, casual, almost motherly, but there was a strange hollowness to it. "Officer," she called. "I can explain." Daniel didn't answer, instead glancing at the bruises around the boy's ankle, wondering how long those marks had been there, wondering how long the boy had been here. He had seen cases like this before, but there was something about the way the boy clutched that small toy car that told him this was not a straightforward rescue. There was a history here, a secret history. The boy's lips trembled as he whispered something, so soft Daniel almost didn't catch it. "Don't let her take me back." That single sentence tightened Daniel's grip on his flashlight until his knuckles ached. He rose slowly, his eyes locking with Margaret's from across the dim room. Her smile didn't falter, but her green eyes flashed with something sharp, calculating. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, each word deliberate, measured, as if they were meant to be both a warning and a threat. Daniel kept his tone even, though his gut told him to call for backup immediately. Why is he chained? The question seemed almost absurdly simple in the face of what he was seeing, but Margaret only tilted her head, the steam from her tea swirling upward as if mocking him. For his own safety, she replied softly, and something about the way she said it, without hesitation, without guilt, made Daniel's skin crawl. He stepped toward the stairs, every creak of the wood under his boots sounding like a countdown. The boy whimpered, his hands tightening around the toy, his eyes darting between Daniel and Margaret like he was watching two storms about to collide. "He's dangerous," Margaret continued, her voice gaining a brittle edge. "You think you're here to save him, but you're not. He doesn't belong out there." Daniel felt a shiver crawl up his spine, not because of the words, but because she truly believed them. The boy's breathing quickened, and Daniel noticed deep scratch marks in the basement wall near where he sat, tiny, desperate etchings that, when counted, seemed to stretch into weeks, maybe months. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though the very house resented this intrusion. "We're leaving," Daniel said finally, his voice cutting through the tension. But when he reached for the key to the shackle, Margaret didn't move to stop him. Instead, she smiled wider, her teeth just visible, her eyes almost glittering. "You can take him," she said lightly, "but you'll bring him back." The way she spoke, it wasn't a prediction. It was a promise, and Daniel's heart sank because, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he felt she might be right. As the lock clicked open and the chain fell away, the boy's legs buckled under him and used to freedom, and Daniel caught him with a firm arm, pulling him close. The boy's skin was ice cold, his heartbeat frantic against Daniel's sleeve. Margaret stepped back into the shadows of the hallway above, her silhouette framed by the faint light from a room beyond. "You'll see," she whispered one last time before turning away, her footsteps vanishing into the creaks of the house. Daniel didn't wait to hear more. He lifted the boy and carried him up the stairs, each step heavier than the last, as if the basement didn't want to let them go. The front door stood open, but the night outside felt no less suffocating than the darkness they had left behind. As they crossed the threshold, Daniel caught a glimpse of movement in an upstairs window, just the edge of a curtain swaying, though the air was still. He didn't look back again. The boy buried his face in Daniel's shoulder, the toy car pressed tightly between them. Somewhere deep in his gut, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. And if you followed this far, you're going to want to hear what happens next, because what they found when they tried to give the boy a safe home was far more horrifying than the basement. So, make sure you subscribe now, because the truth is about to get much darker. Daniel had not driven more than 10 minutes before he began to realize just how fragile the boy in the passenger seat was. The child sat curled against the door, shoulders hunched, blue eyes fixed on the toy car he rolled between trembling fingers. It was as if speaking would break something inside him, and Daniel didn't push. Outside, the rain-slicked streets reflected the passing headlights, painting their escape in fractured gold and silver streaks. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles pale under the flickering dashboard light, each bump in the road making him glance in the rearview mirror. He wasn't just looking for traffic. He was looking for Margaret's car, or worse, the shadow of someone following. He told himself she couldn't possibly know where they were heading, but the image of her faint, knowing smile at the basement door wouldn't leave his mind. The boy's breathing was shallow, quickening whenever the engine slowed, so Daniel kept the car moving steadily, even when they hit the outskirts of town. They passed closed shops, their windows dark and lifeless, until the neon sign of a late-night diner broke the monotony. Daniel pulled in, the wipers squealing across the windshield before stopping. "You need food," he said gently, opening the door. The boy hesitated, clutching the toy tighter, but when Daniel stepped out and extended his hand, the child slid out silently, bare feet slapping softly on the wet pavement. Inside, the diner was warm, its cracked red leather booths smelling faintly of coffee and fried onions. The boy slid into a booth, pressing against the wall, eyes darting toward every sound. Daniel ordered pancakes and hot chocolate for him, coffee for himself, and they ate in silence except for the hiss of the kitchen grill. When the boy finally spoke, his voice was so quiet Daniel almost thought he imagined it. "She said no one would believe me." Daniel froze mid-sip, his hazel eyes locking on the child. "I believe you," he said firmly, but even as he spoke, he wondered how much of the truth he could actually handle. They stayed at the diner for nearly an hour, and when they left, Daniel decided to take the back roads toward the small cabin he still owned near the edge of the forest, remote enough that even Margaret wouldn't think to look there. But as the road narrowed and trees closed in on either side, the boy suddenly tensed, his breathing quick and shallow. "She used to take me through woods," he whispered, "but not to be free." Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, dusty but intact. He ushered the boy inside, locking the door behind them, and set a blanket over the small couch. The boy curled up there instantly, knees to his chest, clutching the toy car against his chin. Daniel crouched down in front of him. "You're safe here," he promised, though the words felt fragile in his mouth. He stepped outside for a moment to grab supplies from the trunk, and that's when he noticed it, the faint crunch of footsteps in the wet leaves just beyond the tree-line. The air seemed to hold its breath. He scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. When he went back inside, the boy was sitting upright, eyes wide, the blanket clutched tightly. "She's here," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the window. Daniel didn't want to believe him, but when he glanced toward the glass, he saw it. The shadow of a figure standing just beyond the porch light, motionless, watching. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The storm outside had grown angrier overnight, each gust rattling the loose panes of the cabin windows as if the forest itself wanted in. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, his leather jacket draped over the back of his chair, a steaming mug between his hands. He could hear the boy breathing softly from the couch in the next room, the rhythmic sound a reminder that for now he was safe. But Daniel's mind was far from calm. Every creak of the old floorboards and every scratch of a branch against the siding made him glance toward the window. That shadow they'd seen last night hadn't been a trick of the light. He was sure of it. But who would come looking for them way out here? He didn't want to think about the answer, because the list was short and dangerous. The drive back was quiet except for the hum of the tires on wet asphalt. The boy kept glancing over his shoulder toward the back window, and when Daniel asked what he was looking at, the answer chilled him to the bone. "The man from the store," the boy said softly. "He was at the basement sometimes." Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles whitened. That meant whoever that was, he wasn't just a stranger. He was part of the nightmare they'd run from. By the time they reached the cabin, Daniel's mind was already mapping out escape routes, checking which bags could be packed in seconds if they had to flee. But leaving would also mean traveling exposed, with no idea who else might be out there looking for them. That night, Daniel made a show of locking the doors and windows, even adding a chair under the doorknob, trying to reassure the boy. They sat by the fireplace, the new blanket wrapped around the boy's shoulders, reading from the nature book he'd picked out. The boy's voice was halting at first, but then grew steadier as he read about wolves, their loyalty to their pack. It was almost peaceful until a sound outside shattered the moment. Not a branch, not the wind, A deliberate step on the porch. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He reached slowly toward the poker by the fireplace, motioning for the boy to stay quiet. Another step, then a faint knock, slow and measured. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to break in. They wanted him to open the door. Daniel rose silently, every nerve screaming, his mind racing through whether this was a bluff, a trap, or the moment he'd have to fight to protect the boy. He was halfway to the door when a voice on the other side spoke his name. Calm, familiar, and the last person he'd ever expected to hear from again. Daniel stood motionless at the cabin door, his hand hovering over the knob, every muscle in his body tight as a wire. The boy's wide blue eyes followed his every move. The red toy car clutched so tightly in his small hand it might snap in two. Another knock came, slower this time, deliberate, each strike echoing through the wooden walls like a warning. Daniel's mind raced. Whoever was outside wasn't a stranger passing by. No one passed by this far out in the woods. Not at this hour. Not after dark. He took a deep breath and yanked the door open. A gust of icy wind rushed in, carrying the smell of wet pine and something metallic. Blood? On the porch stood the same man from the general store, his dark coat dripping with rain, his eyes sharp and unblinking. "We need to talk," the man said, his voice low, his words too calm for the tension in the air. Daniel stepped partially out, blocking the man's view of the boy, his heart pounding. The man leaned in slightly. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," he said. Daniel's mind churned. Was he talking about the boy or something else? The boy had gone pale, his fingers trembling as he set the toy car on the floor. Daniel's protective instinct flared. "You should leave," Daniel growled. But the man didn't move, only smiled faintly before stepping back into the shadows and disappearing into the trees, his footsteps crunching faintly on the wet earth. Daniel shut the door hard and bolted it, turning to the boy. "Who is he?" he demanded. At first, silence. Then, almost in a whisper, the boy said, "He used to come to the basement." The word sent a jolt through Daniel's spine. He crouched down. What did he do? The boy's lips quivered. He watched, and sometimes he took pictures. Daniel fought to keep his expression neutral, though rage was boiling inside him. He knew then the boy had seen horrors no child should ever witness. Hours passed without sleep, the storm outside battering the walls, and Daniel sat by the fireplace with a shotgun resting against the chair. Around midnight, he heard movement outside, quick steps circling the cabin, the creak of floorboards on the porch. He grabbed the shotgun and aimed at the door, his pulse thundering. Then silence. He waited. Nothing. By morning, the world outside was eerily still, the forest blanketed in fog thick enough to swallow the nearest tree. Daniel packed a bag with food and supplies. "We're leaving," he told the boy, who didn't argue. They drove down the long dirt road, but within 10 minutes Daniel noticed the same black vehicle from before trailing them at a steady distance. He took a sudden turn into a narrow side road, hoping to lose them, but the car followed. After 20 more minutes of weaving through the forest backroads, Daniel saw the glint of blue lights ahead. A police checkpoint. Relief flickered, until he recognized the officer stepping forward. It was the same man from the porch, now in a uniform. His smile was cold. "Step out of the vehicle, both of you," the officer said. Daniel's mind screamed for an escape, but before he could move, 2 more police cars boxed them in. The boy's breathing quickened, his hands gripping the dashboard. "Daniel," he whispered, "please, don't let them take me back." Daniel's hand hovered over the gear shift, his eyes scanning for any gap in the blockade. The officer's hand rested casually on his holstered weapon, but there was nothing casual about his gaze. It was the gaze of a man who had no intention of letting them walk away. In that moment, Daniel realized they were not just fighting for survival. They were up against something much bigger, something that had power and reach far beyond a single small-town police station. The boy's secret wasn't just about his mother. It was about the people who had kept him in that basement, the ones who would do anything to silence him. And now, Daniel had to make a choice in seconds: surrender and risk losing the boy forever, or take a chance that might end with both of them dead. Daniel's knuckles were white around the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the police blockade ahead, rain streaking the windshield in frantic patterns as the wipers scraped back and forth. The boy sat silently beside him, his small hands trembling in his lap, the little red toy car rolling between his fingers. The man in the black trench coat, now wearing the authority of a uniform, stood in the middle of the road, his smug expression unreadable under the flashing blue and red lights. Behind him, the shadowy outlines of officers shifted like restless wolves, the forest mist curling at their feet. Daniel's mind raced, calculating distances, angles, possibilities. If he gunned the truck forward, they'd have a chance to break through, but it would also mean drawing fire, and the boy couldn't survive that. The rain pounded harder, almost drowning out the pounding of Daniel's heart. Then, without warning, the man raised a hand and stepped closer, motioning for Daniel to roll down his window. Every instinct screamed to keep moving, but Daniel slowly lowered it, the cold, wet air rushing inside like a warning. "It's over," the man said, his voice flat, emotionless, yet tinged with something darker, pride. "You can't run forever." His gaze shifted to the boy, and a strange, almost predatory smile curved his lips. Daniel's pulse surged, but before he could speak, the man leaned in closer and whispered, "He was never yours to keep." The words sliced through Daniel like a blade, and the boy's eyes darted to him, searching for reassurance that didn't come fast enough. That moment of hesitation cost them. Two officers moved forward, weapons drawn, their boots splashing in the rain. Daniel's mind screamed for a way out, and then he saw it, barely visible through the trees to his right, a narrow dirt path winding deep into the forest. He slammed the truck into reverse, the tires screeching as he swung the wheel hard, mud spraying in violent arcs. Shouts erupted behind him, orders barked, and then the sharp crack of gunfire tore through the night. A bullet shattered the rear window, glass spraying across the seat, the boy curling into a ball as Daniel pushed the truck to its limits. The dirt road was uneven, littered with roots and stones, but the headlights cut a desperate path forward. The sound of sirens grew faint, replaced by the roar of the storm and the deep, haunting silence of the forest. Miles passed, maybe minutes, before Daniel finally slowed, his breath ragged, hands trembling. He pulled over near an abandoned ranger station, the wooden structure sagging under years of neglect. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and old smoke, but it was shelter. He led the boy to a corner, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "You're safe here," he whispered, though his own voice betrayed the doubt clawing at him. The boy clutched the toy car tighter, his gaze heavy with unspoken questions. Daniel knew he couldn't explain, not yet, but the truth was clawing its way out of the shadows. As the night dragged on, every creak of the old building felt like a threat, every gust of wind like a whisper of something closing in. When dawn finally broke, a pale light filtered through the cracked windows, revealing tracks in the mud outside. Boot prints. Daniel's stomach sank. They had found them. He grabbed the boy's hand and led him out the back, weaving through the underbrush, the cold morning air burning their lungs. They emerged onto a ridge, the land falling away into a valley below. And there, parked on the far side, was a single black SUV, its engine running. The man in the trench coat stood beside it, arms folded, waiting. His voice carried across the distance, calm and certain. "Come down, Daniel. This ends today." Daniel glanced at the boy, who shook his head violently, tears welling in his wide blue eyes. There was nowhere else to run, no more roads, no more hiding. Daniel's grip tightened, not just in fear, but in resolve. He stepped forward, the boy at his side, every muscle in his body ready for whatever came next. The man smiled faintly, as if he had already won. But then Daniel spoke, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "You're right, it does end today, but not the way you think." And with that, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small voice recorder, its red light blinking, already filled with every secret, every crime, every truth the man thought was buried. The man's smile faltered for the first time, the color draining from his face. Sirens began to rise in the distance. Not his sirens this time, real ones. And as the sound grew louder, the boy stepped forward, standing beside Daniel, not behind him. The fear was still in his eyes, but so was something else: courage. Together, they waited for the real police to arrive, the truth finally ready to be heard.